afternoon. Dennis is joking about us going to prom because I am the older woman in our relationship. But the truth is, we met a couple of years ago, and when he talked about his vision for a National Diversity Council, I knew it was something that was very much part of life each and every day. The focus of my work and in a large degree my life has been what you're experiencing right in this room. I started working in television news in 1987, and I had just quit Harvard University. I was thinking about going to medical school, and at the last minute decided not to, so I dropped out to start working at a TV station while I tried to figure out what I would do instead. I had a job removing staples from the wall, the bulletin boards of all 3 floors at WBZ-TV in Boston. And my parents, who had just spent roughly $100,000 on my education, to say that they were disappointed comes nowhere close to how they really felt. My mother used to say, "That's a job? Really? That's a job? Really?" But I loved it. I loved it because I love telling stories. I love being part of a team, where our goal was to get different stories on our way. We were woefully underpaid. At the time, they used to have these rules where you could make, in my position, which was a low-level production assistant, you could make a little more money in your paycheck if you did a couple of things. First of all, if your voice was used at all on air, they had to pay you $25 extra. So what we would do if we were sent out to do an interview with the police chief, we would insert ourselves into the story. You would ask leading questions and you answer them. Chief, tell me how you feel about this fire that broke out just a little while ago. And he would pick up an answer, and they couldn't edit around his answer without including your question. And so, boom, $25 extra in your paycheck. Conversely, they had to pay $35 if any body part was used. So we would all, this low-level production assistant, hold the mic here. And so, no matter what, the tips of your fingers would be seen right under someone's chin. And they couldn't edit around it. They were cutting off the bottom of the guy's mouth. $35 extra in paychecks. You were very clever, and if you did it the right way, eventually you could have enough money to both pay your rent and also eat in the same week. So that was something that was very worthwhile. As I grew older and I grew as a journalist, I realized both the changes that I wanted to see both in journalism and also in the stories that we were telling. And in 2010, when we started the In America unit, and we focused on successful documentaries, series like Black in America or Latino in America. We're now shooting our 6th Black in America. We just aired our 3rd Latino in America. We found, or our first Muslim in America, we found that when you told stories of populations whose stories were rarely told, whether it was white coal miners in the battle for Blair Mountain, or Latino farm workers, people think literally the same thing. Nobody ever wants to tell our story. And we discovered that you could be successful in ratings, successful in critical acclaim, successful in, frankly, money that was made, successful in awards that you won by focusing on these kinds of stories. I never, ever ran into other people in the stories I was telling. And it wasn't just about the business case, frankly, for diversity, which people talk a lot about. We need to appeal to a more diverse audience to win. If you're putting on television programming, obviously, you need more eyeballs. But I think, to a large degree, it's also about a moral imperative. Our voices is what creates the historical record of who we are. And when people are left out, you're leaving out a chunk of the story of America. It's unfair. And we have to include all voices. So when I became a reporter, I really didn't understand that I would be chronicling the lives of leaders and the stories of people that we've never really heard of. I love telling stories, whether it was stories of overnight fires or cats that had been stuck in trees. I did that actually a couple times. Whether it was cars that had been stuck in the snow or politicians who had been stuck in a little bit of a mess. Over time, as my opportunities grew as well, I started telling stories of people who are famous and people who are not so famous. And I learned that it was really those folks who were regular people just trying to get by, people who were grappling with employment opportunities in the battle for Blair Mountain, which focused on coal miners in West Virginia. Documentaries like Latino in America that focused on the stories of people in immigrant groups. And even when you started looking at at race and racism, and having some of those uncomfortable and blunt conversations that you could really make a little bit of headway. And I always enjoyed getting into those conversations because I felt that's where true leadership happened. If you didn't turn away, if you allowed people to say how they felt, if you could speak openly about a topic that people often felt uncomfortable about. Or I remember in our documentary about the women of Ground Zero, female rescue workers who came to help dig people out and save lives during 9/11. You could add to the totality of the conversation that was being told. Opportunities for women and conversation about what our nation is and what our nation was, and that giving voice to everyone was not just a good thing, it was absolutely critical if you wanted to paint the portrait correctly. My parents used to tell me the story of how they met. My mom is black and Cuban. My dad is white and Australian. And they met in Baltimore, Maryland in the late 1950s because they both used to attend daily mass. My mom walked, she didn't have a car, but my dad had a car. And they met because my dad used to hit on my mom. He would drive by her on the way to daily mass, and he would wind down the window of his car and ask her out. So one thing, would you like a ride to church? And whenever I tell the story to college students, I have to explain to them. They're like, what does it mean, wind down the window? Because back then, you had to kind of commit, right? Like, he did. Not quite the same, the person's like, and so my mother used to tell the story about how she would always say no. No, thank you. And she would walk out and say, no. You wouldn't take a ride from a guy who you're going to sit next to in mass anyway. And she said, you don't take a ride from someone you don't know about. But every single day you would ask my mother, would you like a ride? And every single day she would say, no, thank you. Until one day she said, yes, I would like a ride. And they made a date to go on a date that evening. But because it was 1958 in Baltimore, Maryland, every single place they went to eat turned them away. Because interracial dating was frowned upon, as my mother would say. And I said, well, what does frowned upon mean? And she said, well, you could get shot. Every restaurant they went to turned away. And my mother took my father back to her apartment and made him dinner because she was incredible, amazing Cuban food. And my mother's entire point of her story, which she would tell actually very often to her 4 daughters, was, see girls, if you could cook, you could get a man. I like to say, I can't make it, but I can make it happen. For her daughters, we took away a different message. My parents decided that they would get married at the end of 1958. But interracial marriage was illegal in Maryland and 16 other states. And so my parents drove to Washington, D.C., and they got hitched. And then they drove back to Baltimore, Maryland, and they lived illegally as a married couple. And when their friends would tell them, whatever you do, don't have children, because biracial children will not fit in this world, I'm number 5 of 6. My parents were terrible listeners every single step of the way, because they knew what they wanted to achieve. They knew that it really wasn't up to other people to sort of say, this is okay with us now. They didn't really wait for that. I used to ask my mother what it was like to walk along the streets of Maryland in the early 1960s. And she would say, if we were with our kids sometimes, people would spit on us. And I said, well, how did you take that? Walking along the street, people spit on you? And she said, well, Lovey, your father and I knew that America was better than that. And I loved when she said that, because it really made me understand that it wasn't about the moment you're in, right? It's about the moment you're working toward. And if you get really stuck about the moment you're in, you're never going to get to the moment you're working toward. She knew. She'd be like, see, they listen to me. My own hard-headed daughters don't listen, but they listen. I love those words. They're so powerful. And I think there's a certain bravery in deciding that you're going to sit firmly on the right side of history. My parents were my very first example of forging on anyway. That if you're going to move through life with dignity, eventually people will catch on and they will follow your lead. My parents were the first in many ways. We would be the first Black and Latino family to move into an all-white neighborhood in suburban Long Island. That was a lot of fun. I don't speak Spanish particularly well because My parents were very interested in having us blend in our neighborhood in Smithtown, Long Island. And I saw this picture not long ago of my family. It was the 1970s. My dad is white and bald. My mom is black, giant, afro. There are 6 kids, biracial, all with afros. We're standing in front of our VW bus, and because it's the 1970s, we're all wearing stripes this way, but the pants had stripes the other way. You know, we probably could have gone with the Spanish. In all seriousness, you fast forward 35 years, and today I represent what America looks like. I represent the growing demographic that is America. I am multicultural and multiracial and multi-ethnic, and my family, which was told, you will never fit in America, we are part of the fastest growing demographic of America. It's amazing how that's happened. Change does come, and you're right, it's not a year. And maybe it's not even 15 years. You sometimes have to march slowly and consistently toward your goal. And I get to take today to have a platform to tell the stories of people like me, who were in some ways outsiders on the margins, but the world is changing. You know, at times I think it's a tough fight. I remember being at NBC News, and I was 8.5 months pregnant with my second daughter, Cecilia. And I pitched a story about going to cover Camp X-Ray. Remember when they took the Taliban prisoners at Guantanamo, and there were no pictures, no one knew sort of the facility they were being held in. And so we got permission from the Navy to go to that facility and shoot it. And I pitched that story, and they loved that story so much that they gave that story to a man who was not 8.5 months pregnant to do that story. And so I did what any bloated, water-retaining, pissed-off pregnant woman would do. Pitching hissy fit till someone put me on a plane to do my own story. And at CNN, when the Asian tsunami happened, I got a call from the assignment desk, and it was a young woman actually. And she said, listen, you're not going to want to go because you're a mom. I had just had my twin boys, so I had 4 kids under 4. And they said, you're not going to want to go because we need someone to go to Thailand to cover the tsunami. But you're a mom, and I'm sure. And I was like, I have 4 children under 4. Put me on a plane. More than me and the entire company wants to be on a plane alone. I don't think anybody. Fighting for diversity often, I think, requires pushing past the barriers of everyone's expectations. I remember when I was looking for work as a reporter early on, and I had an interview at a TV station in Springfield, Massachusetts. And the news director, after giving me a tour of the newsroom, took me back to the engineering department, which meant you had the job, right? They gave me a tour of like the equipment, you're in. And at the end, he said, well, we're not going to give you the job. He said, because we only have 1 slot for somebody black, and you don't read dark enough on TV, like we won't get points for the black hire if we hire you. And I remember thinking, like, should I be more offended that they had 1 slot for somebody black? Or conversely, should I be more offended that I'm not going to get the slot for somebody black? And I remember calling my mother, and she said, Lovey, because she calls me Lovey, don't worry about it. Go someplace where people want you. I remember not long after that I had an interview in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, and the news director there said to me, Soul Dad. That's an interesting name. In that way, when someone says it like that, you know they've been like not interesting at all. This is clearly going to be a problem. And he said, listen, would you be willing to change your name because we're concerned that the viewers may not be able to understand you, because obviously I grapple with my English and it can be very hard. And he said, and I said to him, because my full name is Maria de la Soledad Teresa Marchetti O'Brien, and this is usually from all the Latinos laugh, because they're like, that means the Virgin Mary. Obviously, wouldn't be changing my name, so I wouldn't risk being struck dead by lightning on my way home. But it constantly felt like I had to define myself and redefine myself, and people were constantly looking to put you in a box because it made them comfortable. And they just couldn't understand how you could be black and Latina and have a strange name, but speak English fine, in fact grapple with Spanish. It just didn't make sense to them, and so they were troubled. And I have really tried in my life and my career to not worry about troubling other people. It's not my problem. When I had an opportunity to do a documentary on Dr. King, they sent me to the Robert W. Woodruff Library in Atlanta University Center, and I was doing a documentary called Words That Changed the Nation. It was literally about what he wrote, the words he specifically and literally used in his writings, and also the words that he used, he circled in his personal library. Like, what words did he define himself and his life and his struggle with? And you could see in his writings where anger would give way hope, where optimism would prevail. You could see, in his writings, which were like notes, music, and see where, understand how he was trying to tell the story. What we learned from our first documentary, though, about Dr. King was not that he was not human. People don't tell me that. He was like, Jesus come to earth. And I would say, no, he was not. The point was that he was a regular man. It was the point. He was poetic, clearly. He valued words, obviously. But his writings came from a man who was inspired by words. His writings came from a man who was trying to lift people up after they'd been kicked down. He was a regular man who decided at a moment in time to do great things. He decided he would lead, and so he led. It was not magic. And he wrote this: after one has discovered what he is called for, he should set out to do it with all the power that he has in his system. Do it as if God Almighty ordained you at this particular moment in history to do it. And so he did. And I think when I read those paragraphs, I always think he's talking to us. It's about deciding what is important to you, what you want to have a stake in, and then committing to it. Dr. King was 25 years old in 1954, and he wrote his first sermon, and at this Atlanta University Center, they let me hold it, 2 pages back and front, loose-leaf paper. And I spilled things, and I dropped things, and I was like, I'm going to be the person who rips Dr. King's first speech. Oh my God. But I did. And it's a very simple speech. It's, Alabama preacher talking to his congregation. But reading it, I knew that a year from the moment that it had been written, Rosa Parks would take one of the seats reserved for white people in the front of the bus. And that civil rights leaders would want to boycott the bus system, and that Dr. King would be plucked from obscurity to become the voice of the bus boycott movement. And he was chosen because he was non-controversial, and he was a young man. He was 26 years old at that time. He was a young man who everybody liked. But he would end up articulating a philosophy of the movement. A philosophy that lives on today, and we've seen quoted in Syria, in Libya, in China. But he was chosen because he was young, he was non-controversial, and everybody really liked him. But he would be the leader of one of the world's most important movements because he decided that when he was called upon, he would lead. He would use his voice to take a stand. He would take a position that some people, even his own people at times, would not agree with. And sometimes circumstances call for a leader. And I would argue that that means that all of us have that same opportunity. When circumstances call for a leader, we have an opportunity to say, okay, it will be me. I will lead. In whatever corner of the world you're working, I will lead. And I think that time is again for leadership. And I think that the people in this room are specifically the people who should be answering that call. We did a documentary that aired last week about Latino America 3, and it was a look at the Latino vote. And one of the things we've noticed is that both Latinos who are Democrats and Latinos who are Republicans are frustrated. They feel the Democrats take their vote for granted. They feel that Republicans are making it very hard for them to navigate on the ground when the rhetoric in the primary was so harsh, especially on immigration. They're all frustrated. And they're trying to figure out, how do you move from winning in terms of numbers, fastest growing demographic, to winning in terms of power? Like being the fastest growing demographic isn't all that valuable if you can't leverage it into some kind of power to make change for good. For me, as a journalist who's been telling stories about people, I want to make sure that the images that we keep seeing are not the only images we see. I think it can be very frustrating. And I have a theory about this. You have to bear with me on this theory. But I think this is true. I believe Britney Spears gets out of a limousine with no underpants on, right? White people everywhere do not say, oh my God, I just wanted to die, I'm so embarrassed for us. Here's what white people say this, they say, ooh, I hope that girl gets help. And move on. So, I remember as a child when a serial killer was on the loose, and my mother, we would go to bed at night, it was Son of Sex, my mother would go to bed at night and we would pray, Lord Jesus, I hope he is not black. Because you knew he was. It would come back to you in your community where you live, especially if you were the only black family. It would come back to you, and we laugh about it, but it is completely true that there is a sense of reflection. And here's why, because white people have 100 stories that are told about them. And black people have like 5. And most of them aren't that good. And Latinos have 3. And those are pretty much all about immigration, illegal immigration. And Asians get 1, maybe. And if you're Native American, you get absolutely no coverage at all. But, so my theory is, because I don't do PR, I tell stories, I want to stretch everybody to 100. You know, we're good and we're bad, we're challenged, we're leaders, we're followers, we're all these things. The answer is not to say, let's spin it to do only the good stories. The answer is to say, put all of our stories out there and tell more stories. So that we too can say, yeah, oh, look at Brittany, poor girl, how she gets out. That's what we should be aiming for, just more. It cannot just be a numbers game. And I think that's where people in this room come in, about leadership. We have an opportunity to change the conversation because people in this room have a chance to be the face of the stories we want to tell. I think it's appalling that some of the statistics that we have to cover. You look at the dropout rate. Look at the dropout rate. You know what that dropout rate focuses on? Black and Latino. And if you're a young male in those categories, it's dire. I've done stories in schools where 70% of the people will not graduate, and they know that going in. 2 out of the 3 students going in will not graduate. In my suburban white high school, if those were the statistics, let me tell you something. People would be rioting in the streets, and the New York Times would be covering that story every day. We would not allow it. And yet people are like, yeah, bad statistics on graduation. It is bad for everybody. You know, you mentioned, we may have come on different boats, we're in one boat. If you're in one boat and that boat has sprung a leak, it may not be your side of the boat, but eventually it's going to hit your side of the boat. The affordability of college for young students. My husband and I, our foundation, we send young women specifically to school. There are so many obstacles for young people. And I think we also have to figure out how to get more representation on corporate boards so that the corporate boards look like the people they're trying to sell things to. It's not an insane request. And we all have to support that. It's good for business. Those are the measures of power. Who's graduating from college? Who's not dropping out of high school? Who's actually succeeding in business in a high-profile way? Those are the measure of power. And they require tough conversations and also, frankly, a commitment from people to make the change. And those people are you all in this room. You're the people. I think true leadership is about departing from the script as you know it. True leadership is about taking a different path because you understand the critical value of fairness and justice. True leadership is about those one conversations. True leadership is not about change coming tomorrow or the next day or the next year. Real change, history-making change, takes a lot of time, but it does come. By the time my parents had given birth to my little brother, their 6th child, that very year, 1967, the Supreme Court would overturn the ban on interracial marriage. And my mother had to say, if you wait for people to come around to how you're thinking, you might be waiting a really long time. She was right. By then, they had 6 children, and they had moved ahead with their lives, living a life that they chose for themselves. They were ahead of history, and the rest of the country would then catch up with them. Much of my reporting, I think sometimes oddly, is about leadership, because I don't really start off telling a story about leadership. But I think when you tell stories about people whose stories are marginalized, they become de facto leaders. Their lives are not about empowering themselves, their lives are about empowering other people. And they're willing to talk about it because they understand whatever their struggle was or whatever their success was has a message for somebody else. In our documentary, Muslims in America, we told the story of Muslim families in a small Tennessee town that tried to build a mosque. and the outrage and the hatred that they faced, but also the surprising support they faced as well. From people who said, well, we're not like you, but we support you. We told the story of a church that was torn over the acceptance of a growing Latino population. We told the story of female firefighters who fought for recognition of their efforts during 9/11. And when others would push back, someone said to me once, we were screening that very documentary, and someone stood up and said, you know, I feel like your documentary is divisive. Why are you highlighting women? Everybody who had to showed up on 9/11. And you're making it seem as if the women did something special. And one of the women firefighters was on the panel, stood up, and she said, well, do you know how many stories CNN did on the German shepherds of 9/11? They did 2. So I believe we can do 1 hour on women who make up half of the population and their efforts in one of the biggest tragedies this nation has seen. But there's constantly pushback. I told the story of Gary and Tony, 2 gay men who dreamed of getting married and having a family, except it wasn't allowed. And like my parents, they did it anyway. They went to Canada and tied the knot. They used a surrogate to have their baby. Today, that baby's almost 4 years old. And his fathers today can legally marry in the state that they live in. I think we have an obligation, if we truly want to be leaders, to listen to others to figure out how we're going to move this world forward. I don't think it can be a one-way conversation. We're all in the same boat. We have to figure out how to navigate that boat to the direction we want to be. Cannot be fighting and get there. Dr. King, I think, said it really well when he said this. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher of consensus, but a molder of consensus. On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And I think for people in this room, that is the latter, right? It's the is it right? As we move forward, is it the right thing to do? And I think that requires a certain kind of perspective, a certain kind of bravery, and maybe a certain kind of persistence, most importantly. I remember when I started running 5Ks and 10Ks, I was interviewing the woman who heads the New York Roadrunners. And I said to her, you know, so give me some, you're running 5Ks, so give me some advice. I just don't think I could ever do a marathon. And she said, well, advice is quite simple. Don't stop. I guess you're right. You can follow that advice. Go run a marathon and move. It was kind of absurd, but it was true that in all things that require some kind of bravery, what they require first is just not giving up. Because you can't get to the bravery part if you sort of decided it's just too hard to do along the way. When I was reporting in Haiti for a documentary we were doing on Haitian orphans, 400,000 Haitian orphans, even before the earthquake there. And I would interview missionaries, and I would say to them, they were talking about a job that has no light at the end of the tunnel, right? Haiti was a disaster before the earthquake, and more of a disaster afterwards, and there's no quick fix ever that in the short term is going to come to Haiti. And I would say, so how do you do it? We would go to visit, you know, go and see babies who were living in these like box trucks, 22 baby infants. And we knew that if we came back tomorrow, a bunch of them would be dead, because part of what they would do is they were all starving, and they would feed the babies a mush of milk and rice. But of course, babies can't have milk and rice, so that they would spit it up, they would throw up, and they get dehydrated. But they didn't have any fresh water, so they would give them more milk and rice to get them not dehydrated. You know, so we were in this terrible cycle that was just not going to work, and they would not survive. And I remember I was crying, talking to this missionary. I was like, how do you do this? How do you do this? There's no light at the end of the tunnel. How do you every single day, when you have a passport, you could just go and stop trying? And she said, you know, well, it's really the starfish story. I was like, well, what's the starfish story? So, you know, the starfish story. The boy is walking along the beach. Tide's gone out, so there's a bunch of starfish that have been stranded on the beach. And he starts walking along the beach and chucking starfish back into the water. And a man comes up to him and says, what are you doing? Speech goes on for miles. There's literally 1 million starfish. There is no way you're going to pick them all up. This is a complete and utter waste of time. And the kid picks up a starfish and says, well, I guess it makes a difference to this one, and chucks it. And I thought, in that moment, that really was what it was all about, whether you're talking about missionaries in Haiti or you're talking about whatever work you're personally doing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you sort of have to start in your little corner and start chucking starfish back in, and not worry so much about, can I see the end, but know that you're doing the right thing. And hopefully, if you do the right thing in the right way, other people will see you out on the beach and join you, right? And they'll start in their corner, and they'll start picking up starfish and chucking them in too. And then you get 10 people, and then you get 100 people, and you have 1,000 people, and you have everybody whose job is to throw starfish back in, and that's when we know with critical mass you actually could move the needle. I think whatever goal you're trying to achieve is very much like that. It's not about, yep, I think in 8 years we can wrap this up and move on. No. It's about inspiring other people to do their part, to decide the right thing to do is to move this direction. I'll leave you this afternoon with a quote. It's my favorite quote. I always tell college students, if you could work this quote into a paper, you would definitely get an A. I was making that up at the time, but I'm not sure that I think it would work. It's from Dante, and it goes like this. The hottest places in hell, Dante, he's such a downer, the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who in times of great moral crisis maintain their neutrality. That there's nothing worse than doing nothing and saying nothing when your voice is needed. That actually, even being the perpetrator of something bad is less bad than being the person who's standing by and could jump in and use their voice and say something and opts out. Like, that's even worse than being the person who's perpetrating the badness. And I think that's true. I think that, for me, being a voice for people whose stories are not represented is a mission and a passion, and sometimes it's the equivalent of slamming my head into the wall each and every day. But it's not about the light at the end of the tunnel. It's about picking up a starfish and chucking it in and inspiring other people to do the same so that we really do move the needle whenever that time comes. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.